And thank you for the description of a mature version. Let's hope you're right. Okay, so first of all, we're going to make sure my clicker is working, which it doesn't seem to be. Hey, why don't we turn it on? Bang, there you go. All right, great. So thank you for coming. Nice to see everybody here. So we're going to talk about changing the world, fixing the world. Is everybody up for that? Yeah. Oh, good. You know, because we could just go out and watch the footy instead. Footy? No, we're going to fix the world. Okay, that's great. Okay, so when we're talking about fixing the world, sometimes we need a little help, and I'm not sure whether we're going to get the help from these guys. So we're going to move on, and we're going to look at the nature of the problem. And one of the things that's happened in the last 10 years is we've realized that, contrary to the writings of Karl Marx, may he rest in peace, there are in fact many different kinds of capital, not just financial, and that we need to be involved in caring for and curating these different kinds of capital if we're going to have sustainability as a global economic and social system. So I'm not going to dwell very much on there, but natural capital, physical capital is the manufactured goods, buildings, etc. that we produce. Financial capital doesn't need any explanation. Social capital really has to do with us. And it's a very supportive thing because it has to do with our intelligence, our ability to make things happen. So physical capital and financial capital don't really occur unless you've got the social capital there too. All forms of capital depend on human society being able to organize itself effectively, sustainably, and at scale. So that's the starting point, and that really means politics, right? So politics always starts in the same place, which is people and what they want. And that's pretty simple if you've got a very simple society, because the people and what they want will tend to generate power structures and institutions that satisfy that need. But of course the problem is the little blob on the left-hand side tends to turn into a snowman. And that means that you've got an elite at the top, a little group of people who are basically making these decisions on behalf of everybody else. And sometimes that works, and very often it doesn't quite work, but of course the majority don't have much of a say. Unless, of course, it is a tyranny of the majority, which is something that you get in a country like Egypt, where the minority Coptic population pretty much has to toe the line. So it can work both ways. What we live in is a democracy, and we have to change the snowman into a kind of a cowpat. And that means that we've got a lot of different ideas and views on how society should be organized, and they're all competing together. And we have a sophisticated way of organizing that. These different opinions tend to get consolidated into parties. The parties generate policies. The policies will make some sort of adjustment to the power structures and institutions, and that will feed back to the people, and usually they decide they want something else. Then you get an election. But all of that is informed by political ideologies and values, and that's something I just want to pause to look at a little bit. Hello and welcome.
Hi, sorry.
Thank you. No, don't apologize. That's fine. You've just come in for the interesting bit. So if we kind of map out all of those ideologies, it looks something a little bit like this, and there are three things to notice. One of them is there are a lot of ideologies out there. And the second thing is that they tend to fall into two camps. On the one hand, you've got ones that emphasize the consent of the individual choice. And on the other hand, you've got ones that emphasize membership of a group and the obligations that that might impose. Now, you'll see I put a very hard line down the middle, and that's kind of a graphic mistake, because really it should be a fuzzy line. Really, these things lie on a bit of a continuum between consent and membership, and very often they involve elements of both. Now, the third thing is that none of them really are very complete systems. So if we kind of develop a template for the influence of political ideology, and I apologize for this in advance because I'm kind of taking a 10,000-foot view. We've got room for a lot of debate around these things and what's happening in each one of them, but I'm just trying to give you an impression of the big picture. So let's map democracy onto this template, and we find that democracy is really about political institutions. It has values to do with freedom of choice, individualism. It has a very grand philosophical tradition that goes along with that, but it doesn't push you into any particular kind of religious belief. It doesn't dictate social structures. It doesn't necessarily mean that you have to have a capitalist economic system that goes along with it. It can be combined with other things. If you contrast that with communism, communism is pretty well set on how the economy is going to be run, on how the political institutions are going to look, and other things kind of crowd in around that. Capitalism, well, you know, capitalism should be in inverted commas because it's not really a political ideology, although in a sense it functions a little bit like that. It's big on economic institutions, but it combines with a lot of different political systems. Environmentalism kind of fills a lot of the same areas, but of course an environmentalist and a capitalist aren't going to agree necessarily on how things should be done. And just for contrast, Sharia law. Do we have any Muslims here? No, okay. So under Sharia law, pretty much everything starts with religious belief, and that permeates almost the whole system. Economic institutions, well, there's a little bit of room for negotiation there, and you'll see that Saudi Arabia doesn't have any problem participating in Western capitalist markets. Okay, so what we're seeing here is we've got these little bits of systems that are all kind of competing and combining together, and it's a little bit like having a laptop. And you say, I want a bit of Apple to run some of it, and I want some Microsoft to run some of it, and I want some Linux to run some of it. And you've got all these operating systems on the same computer, and they're kind of bumping into one another, and it's not necessarily a very smooth combination, but we try to sort of mash it together and make it work. And that is kind of the result. We're not actually doing a very good job of curating these essential capitals on which our survival as a human race ultimately depends. And I'm not going to go through these because you can read them in the news almost any day. Okay, can we do it a different way? Well, you won't be surprised to hear that the answer to that, in my view, is yes. So let's just have a little look at where we're going to start with that. Well, we're going to start with humanity. Now, we haven't got everybody down there. I know there's kind of almost 8 billion of us, but this is a representative picture of humanity, and we've got individuals basically and the connections between them. All right. Now, if you start with individuals, and I think most of the political ideologies that we've just looked at put a very strong emphasis on this. If you want the world to improve, if you want to make things better, you're kind of making demands on the individuals who are part of the system. So you're looking at how reliable they are, you know, whether they're emotionally intelligent, how good their performance is, how well educated they are, how responsible they are, what their ethical base is, and you're trying to kind of upgrade all of that in order to make the whole system better. And that applies not just to individuals, it also applies if you're grouping individuals into institutions. Right? You know, what's Amazon doing paying all of that tax in Luxembourg? I mean, Luxembourg, for goodness sake. I mean, what are they thinking of? Or if you get people together into interest groups, teenagers, they're all buying knives and stabbing one another. I mean, what's up with teenagers, right? As a constituent group of society. We want teenagers to kind of get their act together and improve. So we're always going back to the individual and trying to make sure that the individuals participate better in the wider society. But what if we did it another way? What if we looked not at the nodes of the system, but at the connections between them? What if we could improve not the individuals, but the connectivity of the system? Then we have to ask 3 questions if we want to improve connectivity. And the questions are, do we know each other? Are our goals aligned? Is the arrangement fair? Now, I know this is Cambridge, and you guys in Cambridge like things to be complicated, right? Because if it's not complicated, it can't be true, right? So here we are. This is kind of adding a few layers of complication. We can give names to these things, and we can give definitions to these things. And that's important because in order to move from a simple question to the kind of questions that you could use on a survey in order to get quantified information about how good relationships are, you need to be able to kind of get a broader picture. So with contact, what that is doing is telling us about how well people understand each other. It tells us about how efficiently information is flowing through a system. It tells us about privacy. It tells us about transparency. It tells us about accountability. That's where it goes. Commonality tells us a little bit how we're going to handle those arenas of competition in society. Who is a football supporter here? Great. Any Liverpool supporters? Hey, okay, everybody else can go home. All right, so when I switch on the TV and I watch my 11 millionaires running around on the pitch, right, trying to win the game, why is it that these guys don't just kind of punch each other out in order to win the game? I mean, why not? Well, it's because even though it's a highly competitive environment on the football pitch, everybody is agreed on an overarching commonality of the rules of football and the rules of the competition. So we've got an arena of competition that exists in a wider commonality. So that's why commonality is important. I think I've gone backwards there. Let's go forward again. Ding. Okay, there we go. And parity. Parity is about participation. Because if you can't motivate people to participate, then you're going to have a society made up of individuals all kind of doing their own thing. So it's very important that any arrangement is felt to be fair by both sides, because if it's not, one of the sides is going to withdraw, and then you're not going to be able to fix things as easily. So what is it that drives connectivity? Well, the obvious one, I'm going to start at the bottom, is physical distance. There is a reason why you kind of know your next door neighbor better than you know the people down the end of the street, right? Because you're always falling over their bin. So physical distance has a lot to do with it. Moving up, lifestyle choices, habit, customs, and protocols. Do you have any married couples here? Oh, okay, so you guys, what are your names?
Kristen.
Krista.
And Brent.
And Brent, right. Brent?
Brent.
Mm-hmm.
Wonderful. Okay, so when you first saw one another, did you kind of instantaneously decide, that's the person for me, and get married the next day? No, you didn't. Right. Okay, so what did you do?
So we got to know each other, and over the course of time, fell in love and got married.
Right. Okay, so you dated.
Yep.
So you were kind of fixing the contact arrangements around your relationship. You know, we're going to meet next Tuesday. And the purpose of that actually was to kind of feel out the different commonalities and whether or not you were compatible and whether you like the same things, whether you both support Liverpool, right?
Exactly.
Okay, so that would have done a great deal to help you with your relationship. That sort of thing. Now, if Brent had said to you at one of these dates, look, actually, Krista, you know, what I'm really interested in is just working all of the time. I want you to do the cooking, the washing up, looking after the kids. Is that all right by you? What would you have said?
No way.
No way, okay, because that wouldn't be fair. Okay, all right, so we've got parity coming into it too. So the argument is that actually we know all of this stuff. We know these three questions. We don't necessarily put them in the form that they're in here, but we work with them all the time in order to manage our personal relationships. Now here's the really interesting bit. The same rules apply not just to personal relationships, but to rules embedded in financial and social institutions and structures and procedures decided by government. Now, let me just ask you, what's your name?
Dorothy.
Dorothy. Okay, so Dorothy, if you were going to count up the number of personal relationships that you have, I mean, just kind of ballpark figure, what would you say?
Kind of small, really. 50.
About 50. That's pretty good. All right, so 50 people. And how many people do you think you're connected to through political and economic systems?
Probably fewer.
All right, so I would say...
What you mean mean, really.
Okay, all right. So I would say you've actually got a connection to the person who's picking the coffee beans,
Yeah, okay. You're gonna say
one
that.
atom of which ended up in your cup
Yeah.
in Cafe Nero this morning. So how many of those kinds of people are there? There are a lot of them. Okay, so we've actually got quadrillions of relationships with people that are mediated through political and economic institutions. Now, very, very thin relationships, all right, with very low levels of connectivity, but the relationship nevertheless exists. And here's the key thing. Institutions like government, markets, and companies connect us all en masse on terms over which we have very little control, but which nevertheless have a massive effect on human behavior. All right, let's have a look and see how that works out in business. This is like a picture of a company. Okay, so it's a kind of listed company. There are shareholders who buy shares on the stock exchange. And these are the main stakeholders in a particular company. So if we ask the question, is this network fair? We find actually there are some people who are benefiting from the company in a much bigger way than others, and actually they are driving the whole policy of the company, because these fellas in the middle, they are under legal obligation to return profit to the shareholders, and the shareholders will exert pressure on the management to make sure that that happens. So you get short-term targets, you get companies that are interested in making sure that they get a profit rather than in looking at the wider interests of the other stakeholders. Now, if we ask the question, where is the contact? Do these people know one another? Well, of course, you've got these kind of little communities within the system where people know each other very well. But the relationship with the investors is a very thin one. You could be an investor in this imaginary company and not even know it. You could be an investor for like 5 seconds if there is a high-speed trading platform operating your investment, and then you're out of it. So you don't have much relationship with the company. You don't really kind of know or care very much about what's happening to the other stakeholders in it. You may not even know that you're there. And if we ask what the different interests are around the company, in other words, are our interests and goals aligned, the answer is really no. Because these guys are in it for a totally different reason to these guys down here. If you work for the company, you're going to be interested in your job. You want job security. You'd like a raise at the end of the year, if that's okay, please. And actually, all the different people involved in the company, all the different stakeholder groups have a slightly different interest, although they are all engaged with the company itself. So you can see that asking the 3 questions about a listed company actually tells you something about the way that it's working and the reasons why it might not be working so well in terms of the interests of wider society. Okay, let's look at politics. This is going to be relevant, I'm afraid, so take a deep breath. Here we are, 3 questions for the European Union. Where does that all start? Well, here we are, the member state voters, all right, that's us down here. And this is the member state voters in, let's say, France. And we have a little bit of contact stuff going on, you know, because we're flying back and forth on EasyJet. And over the last 30 or 40 years, we've sort of got to know the French. And we've realized, actually, French people, you know, they're kind of okay. They're not really that different from us. So there's a bit of sort of benefit of contact going on in that area. And we've realized that there are some commonalities that pull us together. And in fact, that is the whole purpose of the European Union as originally stated. The process is one to create an ever closer union amongst the peoples of Europe. And even in 2012, okay, it still says between the peoples of Europe, not between the states. Now, of course, the problem is that in order to realize that, the European Union has created this sort of superstructure of bureaucracy, which is felt very acutely by us down here, because the government has ceded a certain amount of sovereignty to the European Commission, and although we've, in theory, agreed to let them do that, Now what's happening at the European Commission is that it's functioning almost as the centre of a federal state, because there are edicts coming down which affect you and me that we may feel, well, actually I don't quite agree with that. You know, I'd rather it was controlled somewhere a little closer to me. So we've got a problem with parity in the system. There is a sense on our side in the UK, amongst a lot of us, all right, that it's not quite fair. But if we want to influence the European Commission and go back in the other direction, we've got to establish some contact, and that's really what it looks like. And it's pretty indirect. All right, so what we can do is we can vote in another government, and the government can send somebody to the European Council, and the European Council can appoint a member to sit on the European Commission, and that member may or may not be able to influence what the European Commission actually does. So that doesn't really feel like control, right? From our point of view, there is a sense that there isn't actually parity going on, that there isn't actually commonality going on. And I think that's really why we've got the situation we have now with Brexit, because half of the population thinks, well, you know, we could make the European Commission work, we could get Europe better, and the rest is saying we've had enough of this, we want out. And you can see relationally, by asking the three questions, we can understand why that is happening. Let me make sure I'm not running out of time. How long have we been going on?
20 minutes.
You have to speak a bit louder, I can't hear you.
10 more minutes.
10 more minutes, all right, oh good, okay.
Leave 2 minutes for me at the end.
All right, so we have time to look at finance. 3 questions for US investment banking in 2007. So, you know, in that period we had this big black box, and on one side of it we had people with mortgages, and they're feeding money through their debt arrangements into that big black box. And on the other side of it, you've got investors who are making a profit out of the financial system. What could go wrong with that? Well, let's ask some questions. What about the contact? You see, the problem is that the people here in the investment banks and the people here in the hedge funds, they don't know these guys down here. And the guys down here, very often they've taken out very ambitious mortgages, and they're very highly geared, and so they're very vulnerable. But these guys don't know that. They've bought these packaged up debt, and they're selling it as securities to the hedge funds, and nobody knows really what's going on down there because there isn't enough contact. They don't know each other. Now, the people who should know are the ratings agencies. They should be telling everybody in the big black box, you should be careful of these fellas, because they don't really know what they're doing. And if interest rates go up, they're going to be in trouble, and they won't be able to pay money into the system, and then there's going to be problems. Now, the ratings agencies didn't do that. They were busy giving AAA ratings to these fellas down here. Why were they doing that? Well, there's a commonality issue, because actually their goals are not the same as the people who are running the investment parts of the system. These fellas are paid by fee by the investment banks. So as long as they get the fee, they're good. The investment banks are their friends. The investment banks don't want to hear that these fellas can't pay their mortgages. So they don't get told that. But of course the investment banks depend on that flow of cash coming in. And if it doesn't come in, they're going to be in trouble, which of course is what happened. And who ends up picking up the tab? Well, it's us up here, isn't it? The taxpayers. So parity situation, is that fair? Is that arrangement fair? Well, it doesn't feel like it, doesn't it? Because in a sense, what has happened to us in the last 10 years in Europe began with faulty relationships on Wall Street. And that's a little worrying, because if you go back to the interwar period, what went wrong in the Second World War, what went wrong in Germany was partly a result of Versailles, okay, but it was very largely also a result of the Wall Street crash. So what's happening in the economy, the way that we connect together, the degree of connectivity in the big economic systems is really important, because if you know one another, if you have a smooth flow of information, and if your goals are aligned, and if everybody understands that the system is fair, it's much, much less likely to crash and cause the kind of issues that we've recently had. Okay, let's just move on to ideology. You see, the problem with ideology is that it sets very ambitious goals. And we love this stuff, right? You know, I mean, we kind of put it on buildings and things, you know, freedom, equality, fraternity. But it's very hard to live up to. Our argument would be a good society is defined not by abstract ideals, but by how it connects its members. And if you think about it, the ethical side of it is built in to parity. If everybody believes that an arrangement is fair, then you've got an ethical basis. All right, why focus on relationships? Well, I'm not going to dwell on this, but you can see actually there's an argument for saying relationships are a fundamental category of existence. We don't pay attention to them. It's not been emphasized in the Western political, philosophical tradition, but relationships are really important. If they don't work, nothing is going to work either. So let's just go back to our little kind of map of the ideology. And if we say there is something called relationism, it would map out like this. We've added an extra kind of cell onto the system, right? And relationships drive everything. Nothing works if the relationships aren't working. And even Mike will say a little bit about this in a moment. I mean, in a sense, it even points towards a certain kind of religious belief. Not that it's determinative. If you don't believe anything, you can still think relationships are a good thing and make them work. But it does have that dimension to it. Can we fix stuff? Well, okay, a very quick bit from me on this. Companies. That was the first thing that we looked at. This is like a map, if you like, of the way that capitalism works. This is the kind of money going around. And here's you and me down here. And we're kind of putting our money into the system, and in the financial market, something gets kind of scooped off in management and performance fees. So the money is supposed to go into businesses, and businesses don't always produce the results that we want, so you get these kind of negative externalities, which is what we were talking about with the capitals, okay? Some of the money comes back, but there's a lot of other bad stuff that's going on as well too, and we don't feel able fully to control that. So how do we fix that using the three questions? Well, you form a relational company, or you say to companies, look, if you do these few things to reform the way that you work, you will be a relational company. You will have stakeholders who are joined together by those three questions. They know each other, or at least, the system of information flow is open. Their goals are aligned. They're all trying to get towards the same thing. And the arrangement is fair to all of them. So the company becomes not an engine of wealth creation, which is what the PLC is at the moment, and it does a really good job of that, but it's not just that. It becomes an engine of common good that satisfies the needs of the investors, but it doesn't trample over the needs and the rights of the other people who also have a big stake in the company. All right, so, where do we go with the three questions? Where do we go with relationism? What we've just talked about with companies is part of organizational reform. We have something called relational thinking. Going into organizations, measuring relationships and get the relationships right. Your organization is going to work better. That's a huge thing that's going on right now. We're working in Europe. We've got this book here, The Confederal Europe. If you want to buy a copy, there are a few copies available here. This is relational policy. If you take relationism, the three questions, into European policy and say, how could we do Europe better? This is an idea of what it could look like. So, worth a read.
There's a free summary of it there too.
And there is a brief summary if you want to do it in 10 minutes instead of 2 hours. Are these free?
Yep.
Yeah.
Okay, you can get that for free. All right, and Mike in a moment is going to tell us a little bit about relational peace building. If you want more information, you can go to the website, relationism.net. And we're back to the start. So it just remains really to say that, I mean, this is a big idea, right? And big ideas can be kind of out there. Oh, that would be nice, but it ain't going to happen. Or it can be a big idea that, why did nobody think of this before? Why? You know, it's that simple. And I think the reason for that is that we're all busy kind of telling one another that we ought to be better people. And we're not really thinking about these simple three questions that relate to the connectivity that pulls us all together. And this is not, you know, my idea, it's not Mike's idea. We don't have this kind of big thing and we're asking you to sign up to it and say, wonderful, we agree with you. This belongs to you guys. Like, you know, you two with your dating. And everything that we do, it involves those three questions. We use it all the time. Why do we not apply it more widely to organizations, to the economy, to politics? Because, hey, we would do a much better job of looking after our capitals, including global warming, if we did that. It's a great place to start.